I understand it, they're unrolling the whole 120 foot, so be there, I would say. Okay, the paper's called Why the Beatles Became the Beatles, the British Beat, 1957-65, and I'll try and keep a bit close to time. In an encounter in 1960 between John Lennon and the Beat poet Royston Ellis, which quote A on the handout, led to the Beatles respelling their name, the Beatles. You need the handout to get that. It thus stands as one of the most visible signs of a complex post-war Atlantic cultural crossing, the Beats' arrival in the UK, that remains largely unelucidated. Adopting Robert Van Hulberg's contention, quote B on the handout, that minor poetry should be regarded as one of the more reliable indices of the cultural level of a nation, my paper considers how British Beat poetry can stand as one index of post-war British cultural activity. But my starting point must be that beat is a term so broad in compass that it creates something of a problem in itself. And so I sought to consolidate it first by approaching 40 poets who have been associated with the British Beat in the UK to try to discover what their perspectives might be. And interestingly, of these 40 poets, almost all refused to accept the label that they were Beat. This unease accompanies the terms Atlantic crossing that I think needs elucidating in itself. So to help me in my research in 1999 and again in 2010, I asked my 40 poets questions about the British Beat. And as I've said, only a few saw themselves as such. Michael Horowitz, Pete Brown, Dave Cunliffe, Libby Houston, Steve Snade and Ian Macmillan. All writers, of course, dislike compartmentalisation, but the key reason for rejecting a label seems to rest in transatlantic tensions at the time. Mutual doubts over quality emerged. So, for some British Beats, Kerouac's and Ginsberg's occasional embrace of the confessional was unattractive, Kerouac's unevenness was criticised, and his Buddhistic leanings seemed as unconvincing. Ginsberg's advocacy of transcendental meditation and his dodgy advocacy of LSD, as Pete Brown put it, and for Roger McGough, Ginsberg's strident loudness limited his appeal. Corso was identified as limited and a shit when you met him. Such reservations were part of a fiercer UK hostility. Tanby Mitu's Poetry London's 1960 issue, Poetry London, New York, may have featured Ginsberg's poem Rocket, Corso's Frightening Difference, and part of Kerouac's Mexico City Blues, but in that very same issue of his magazine, Tanby Mitu described the Beats as imprecise, with few even worthy of print. Such ambivalences make British poets unlikely to subscribe to the appellation Beat then and even now. Ferlinghetti in 1963 expressed a reciprocal unfavourable opinion of the English poetry he'd heard during visits in 1963 and 1966, whilst for Ginsberg he felt that a succession of bad local poets monopolised the time at the famous 1965, quote C, 1965 Albert Hall First International Poetry Incarnation. So clearly reasons exist for mutual antagonism and explain why writers like Adrian Mitchell, one of Ginsberg's bad local poets, rejected the label British Beat altogether. Forget, he wrote, forget about British Beats. None of us were that. All this lends piquancy to Pete Brown's 1959 poem, Few, because he was, after all, one of the few that accepted the label, quote D. Alone, tired, half-drunk, hopeful, I staggered into the bogs at Green Park Station and found 30 written on the wall. Appalled, I lurched out, thinking surely Surely there must be more of us than that. This sense of isolation in part relates to this antipathy towards the beat mode, and understanding its sources soon becomes not only a literary issue, but also a matter of hybrid cultural transnationalisms. Despite all the hostility I've been outlining, US beats were, I found out, catalysts for many UK literary artists, as their perspective sharply contrasted with what was predominantly at that time a post-war drabness that I remember very well from my childhood. VE Day euphoria was quickly replaced by war weariness, as austerity and rationing, made worse by US insistence that Britain repay its war loans, meant living conditions were just about as harsh as in wartime. Radical thought was marginalised as universities, dominated by Oxford and Cambridge, as they still are today, tended to promote Cold War ethics and post-Stalin, shunning the left in general. The UK's futile invasion of Egypt after Nasser's 1956 Suez Canal nationalisation and the USSR's suppression of the Hungarian Rising that same year, which largely destroyed British Communist Party membership, accentuated a defensiveness. Cyril Connolly saw the socio-cultural climate as bureaucratised and war-weary. So conformist was it that, in Jim Burns's words, quote, E on the handout, it is difficult to convey just how square the square world was. This period of austerity, encapsulated in the predominance of black and white in photography and film and the emergence of kitchen sink realism, was typified by the quotidian privations of rationing. Rationing because there was just not enough boats to transport materials around the world, captured by Libby Houston's 1961 poem, Post-War, quote F. I remember my mother talking about bananas in 1944. They came in paper bags in neighbours' hands when they came, and took their time over the coming. I remember bananas arriving in the UK. The arrival of strident yellow Caribbean bananas, taken off rationing in 1954, clashed with austerity's drabness, and I think metonymically prefigured the beat's brazen upsetting of post-war UK's cultural reticence. In Brian Patton's words, quote, G, the rawness and energy was like a sunrise in a vault occupied by the dull English movement poets. Writing became not a grey record of austerity, but liberating. Michael Wilding called it finding a creative language from lived contemporary idiom. Ginsberg's trenchant words, America, go fuck yourself with your atom bomb, signalled a highly colourful literary arrival. For Michael Horowitz, the beats became a breaking out into celebration, a contention borne out by the brightly coloured covers of 3 British beat anthologies, a 1967's Love, 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 1969's Children of Albion, and 1971's Come On Everybody. Along with Cunliffe's significantly earlier 1964 Poetry 8 and Feldman's and Gartenberg's 1959 anthology, Protest, The Beat Generation and the Angry Young Men, and I think I should add Jean Barrow's anthology, The Beat Poets, these constitute an evolving map of this scene in these years between 59 and the mid-60s. Most of the poets that were featured in these anthologies from the UK and who were reading these other anthologies were born in the early 1940s, a bit like me, so were teenagers when On the Road came out in Britain in 1958. Interest before this mostly depended upon word of mouth. Jan Lovelock contends that the British beat's origin is really linked to On the Road's success, even though Howell's censorship or sheer chance had seen a few earlier pioneer encounters. The beats surfaced really only in the late 50s in the UK during 58-59. Symptomatically, Jim Burns recalls reading Jazz of the Beat Generation, the essay in New World Writing in 1957, not even realising that Jean-Louis, that's the name it was published under, was in fact Jack Kerouac. The beat phenomenon only broke in the wake of On the Road's reception and the repercussions of Hal's censorship. But awareness now did bloom, and quite fast. Lee Harwood's account of discovering beat writing is really pretty representative of what was going down. Quote, 1958-59, Ferlinghetti, Coney Island of the Mind via a US student at Queen Mary College. 59-60, Jack Kerouac's On the Road via friends with US contacts. And City Lights, Pockets, Poets, Corso's Gasoline, Ginsberg's How. This chronology meant British beat contact with US beats mostly coincided with the peak of what I'll describe as beat's second wave, which is really a broad cultural phenomenon generated by late 50s media hype around How, On the Road, and as beat begins to become the celebrity signifier that it was for a while in the 60s. The British beat's inspiration fed then off this second wave. The beat that the British beats was attracted to was, in Nuttall's telling phrase, Ginsberg's generation, recognising how the beats, already by then comprehensively media processed, acquired a real allure. And by allure, I seek to convey the glamour this late 50s, early 60s US beat possessed. The glamour of the literary rebel, meshing with a contemporary fascination with the existential rebel, evident in the acclaim Colin Wilson's Uneven the Outsider attracted in 1956. The censorship of Howl and Naked Lunch granted beat writing an aura. Hard to get hold of, it promised a sort of authenticity, almost quasi-existential. This was enhanced by a publishing time lag that existed then between America and the UK, which we've really all forgotten about. 50s British editions of US publications usually came out a couple of years after American publication. On the Road wasn't published in England until 1959, in fact. Original imprints needed to be smuggled in if they were going to be encountered, and this smuggling was part of that exciting discovery. To this extent, Nuttall's claim that the beat phenomenon was a literary thing is correct. The British beats' American encounters reconstituted for them the category art and redefined what being a poet entailed. Poetry's exclusivity in the UK was, in the eyes of the British beats, shattered by the US beat modes, and in particular by its excoriating dismissal of more conservative modes, particularly that generated by the new criticism in the States, which helped crystallise British beat discontent with the movements and groups' dominance. The movement is described up there for you if you've not heard that phrase before. As Tom Pickard put it, quote, J, a dart of Larkin and the movement and the usual dreary offerings from the Oxbridge literary mafia made me despair. Jim Burns sums it up, quote, K. I didn't want to know about that whole Little England thing. Instead, the British beats readings led away from the movements and groups' relatively formal diction and metrics into an exploration of the new American poetics' open forms that the beats had opened up. Central to this was the issue of accessibility, a redefinition of writing's relation to culture could and was effected. In Lee Harwood's words, quote, L, it was an immense release. Poetry seemed the territory of a particular social group up until then, middle class, academic, and talked in a remote and artificial and passionless language, in rigid forms. The beats somehow were a green light to write directly how one felt with spontaneity and wildness. Quote M, a hubbed network explored this sense of release. A London-Oxford axis that often took to the road. Weirdly, a Carshalton group, Chris Torrance called it the mob. A North England anarcho-cultural group, an Edinburgh-Glasgow nexus, and Liverpool's Merseysound. There were other hubs as well. This strongly regional, often northern non-metropolitan accent suited disaffiliated protest. Yet the British Beat did not typically turn to critical yet relatively conservative portraits of grey, class-bound lives. They didn't become angry young men. They didn't embrace kitchen sink realism. The British Beat instead took up the Beat's vibrantly performative, liberatory energy. Different nodes of the British Beat did have distinct emphases. Lickyard, for example, sees northern British Beat writing as closer in spirit to the British Beat, to the Beat sensibility. Closer, say, than Liverpool's naive appropriation, as he calls it. Maybe because the vitality of the Merseyside pop music scene and its contacts with the London-based Horowitz-Brown axis generated a pop-oriented playfulness in Liverpool that wasn't quite so attractive to the northern Beats. Variations revolve about how much intimacy was established with Michael Horowitz's caravanserai, in fact. When Houston views Cunliffe's poetry as heavy, very heavy, this is perhaps what might be called a Cunliffe ambit. This is because what might be called a Cunliffe ambit was much more hard left and more working class than Horowitz's more middle class group, though the latter's entrepreneurial nous gave it a higher profile. Such schematizations have some validity, but they founder ultimately on the fluidity that characterizes Beat exchanges always. And as Cairncross observes, a lot of us had a left-wing outlook. Yet it does identify how the British Beat's celebratory breakout helped some British Beats to hone dexterous, open, often short, even slight, performance-oriented poetry, possessing an immediacy far from easy to achieve, actually, and very difficult to sustain. It was also often shocking, latching onto how Ginsberg's technique of explicit attack. Howl is the key model again, I've already mentioned it, conjoining portraits of madmen fucked in the arse by saintly motorcyclists and screaming with joy with denunciation of the scholars of war. The role of shock is signalled by Houston's account, I love this, of how in 1961 a reading of an expurgated version of Howl was shouted down because the fucks were being omitted. Houston therefore speaks of a beat mode featuring direct address, explicit, frank, open, accessible. For Houston, the Beat's strident attacks on Cold War mindsets gave British Beats more confidence in their political stances. For example, more confident about being engaged with the campaign for nuclear disarmament, more confident of taking up anti-war allegiances later in the 60s as Vietnam took off. David Miller similarly urges that the British Beat drew upon the Beat's freight of social rebelliousness. For Steve Snade, it was a lifestyle choice. The Beat's arrival is best thought of as having both a literary and a socio-cultural impact. For Britain's Beats, it was an opening up of possibility of being heard and published as the habits of mind of the age of austerity faded and publishing began to gather momentum once more. This enthusiasm conflicted with a widespread contrasting anti-Americanism, came into clash with it, which was mistrustful of the seductiveness of American models, and that even caused Richard Hoggart, founder of British Cultural Studies' attention to working class culture, to regret the way his, quote, his jukebox boys in 1957 spend their evenings listening to the Nickelodeons, youths aged between 15 and 20 with an American slouch.